Elizabeth, we are live. You can start. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I understand I'm online, and I want to first of all thank Miguel Oliveira for inviting me to give these lectures. I think he has been a model not only for Brazil, but for the world in keeping linguistics alive in this rather difficult situation that we're in. So I very much appreciate that. And before we start, I would like to say that I really enjoy questions and comments. And Professor Oliveira has agreed to collect questions and comments in chat and to maybe select them, but certainly read them to me after a break. So the way this is going to go is I will talk for approximately an hour and a quarter. And then there will be a short break and then discussion time. I hope that works. If it doesn't, we can modify this for next time. So let me get started. Next. Let's start with talking about the purpose of the lectures. There will be 6. And I want to take the opportunity to introduce some principles of cognitive linguistics, especially the subtype called construction grammar, as conceptualized by Goldberg in various publications. I picked out here in 1995 and 2006, because those are really the basis of constructionalist historical work that I will be talking about. Here's a picture of her in Berlin. The next. I also want to introduce some principles of a constructional approach to language change, especially the subtype called constructionalization, that Graham Trousdale and I wrote about in 2013. And there is a picture of him in Edinburgh. I will compare constructionalization and grammaticalization, show they're complementary. When we first started work on constructionalization, people continually asked the question, are you trying to get rid of grammaticalization? And I said, and Graham agreed, no, not at all. They are complementary, and I will show you how. I'm going to use 2 different examples. One is the development of the semi-modals. I'd rather be fishing, I'd sooner be fishing, you'd better be fishing, or I'd better be fishing, which have been discussed in terms of grammaticalization. But I think you can do something more and more elaborate anyway in terms of constructionalization. So I'm going to show how that works. And I'm also just going to discuss the development of dative and benefactive alternations, such as I gave her a book and gave a book to her. I built a house, built her a house, I built a house for her. Those, of course, cannot be discussed in terms of grammaticalization. So that will illustrate the fact that constructionalization, because of the nature of construction grammar, goes beyond the remit of grammaticalization to look at pretty much any kind of structure in the language. And at the end, I will discuss the mechanisms, subjectification, and constructional and intersubjectification from a constructional perspective. Graham and I realized that we didn't discuss those at all in the book. Maybe we mentioned them somewhere, but we didn't discuss them. And since I, at an earlier time, wrote about subjectification in grammaticalization, I thought it would be good to think about subjectification and intersubjectification in terms of a constructionist perspective. So that will be the last talk. Next. Now, I really want to emphasize this, that I take models of grammar as hypotheses about how grammar works. Models and theories are dynamic. They are subject to change. They are interpretations. So one purpose is to bring you up to date with some rethinking on constructionalization, and I hope you will contribute to that rethinking. It's really important to have other people's perspectives and join in a collaborative enterprise in thinking these issues through. Next, please. So today, I'm going to outline some very basic principles of cognitive linguistics that are relevant to the remainder of the lectures. One could talk about cognitive linguistics forever, but I will just really have only 3 slides on that. And then I will talk about construction grammar of the Goldberg variety, what is meant by a usage-based model of language. I will remind you, probably rather than introduce, remind you of Croft's model of a construction, and then talk about some principles of usage-based historical linguistics. Next. Okay. Cognitive linguistics in a nutshell. This really is a nutshell. In its various manifestations, it goes back to the 1970s, the work of Charles Fillmore, who's on the left, and Lang Acker, who articulated many of the foundational assumptions of cognitive grammar in his 2-volume book, Theoretical Foundations of Cognitive Grammar. Next. And among the basic assumptions are knowledge of language consists of 4 meaning pairings, various levels of abstraction that are unified in speech. In other words, and this is really important, I'm going to spend some time on this, language is a symbolic sign system. Linguistic relationships are not invariably all or nothing affairs. Linguistic categories are gradient, and there are no sharp boundaries. Meaning is not fixed. There's a meaning potential. This means that there's an essentially unlimited number of ways in which an expression can prompt dynamic cognitive processes. However, context grounds and restricts interpretation. Those 2 statements are really the background for my thinking about how to deal with change, which I will get to later. Another basic assumption is that there's no or very little innate linguistic knowledge. Blueprints of language are learned. Constructions are linked in networks. And if you would like to follow up on the growth of ideas in cognitive linguistics, Goldberg 2013 is a very useful reference. That's a handbook paper in Hoffman and Charles Jo's Handbook of Cognitive Linguistics. Next, please. Okay, moving to construction grammar. There are several models, I'm sure you know that. The one that has been used most in historical linguistics is cognitive construction grammar, which I'm abbreviating as COG construction grammar, and was developed by Goldberg and influenced somewhere around 2000 by Croft's 2001 book, Radical Construction Grammar. Another model that's used primarily by Fried is sign-based construction grammar, and that's more formal than Goldberg's model and is not usage-based. I will not discuss it, though Fried does do some very interesting historical work. While drawing on cognitive linguistic assumptions, Goldberg refined some, developed some additional ones. And the ones that I find particularly relevant are knowledge of grammar is dynamic, can change over time. This, of course, was in Langecker too, but it's fundamental to Goldberg's view. Grammar consists of constructions. These are form-meaning pairings, which are stored in a constructional lexicon known as the constructicon. Next, please. There's no strict dichotomy between lexical and grammatical constructions. There's a continuum. And that's very important for change. So if you are accustomed to thinking of change in terms of grammaticalization, it's absolutely fundamental to it, because you start out with a lexical item that ends up as a very small grammatical item, typically. So lexical constructions are things like words, like constructionalization, which is obviously a complex word. They are complex clauses, like ditransitives of the sort, Mary gave me a scarf. And those are on the content pole of meaning. Grammatical constructions, however, present tense and possessive case, are on the procedural end of the pole, which requires a note about what procedural means. The next, please. Procedurals as a category were first theorized by Blakemore in 1987, but I'm going to take a quotation from Hansen because she does a lot of historical work. Procedurals guide interpretations in context and point to particular, more or less, schematic frames of interpretation for the utterance hosting such interpretations. Guide interpretations in context. So something I've been looking at but want to talk about, a little discourse marker like, by the way, that clearly guides interpretation in context, points to a more or less schematic frame. So points to a larger set of discourse markers and to the fact that what you have are two clauses combined. You can think also about aspect. If I use something like, we had a problem getting online this morning. The had in there indicates a temporal relationship, pointing, therefore, to a relationship between one time and another, one event and another. So the decline from lexical to grammatical is key to work in cognitive linguistics in general and in Goldberg in particular. And she says semantics, information structure, and pragmatics are interrelated, all play a role in linguistic function. Now, what's meant by pragmatics there? What's meant is that there are conventional aspects of pragmatics. That's well known in the famous example of "Can you pass me the salt?", which has nothing to do with the ability to pass the salt, but is a directive. I will show several other examples of that, but it's really important to think of construction grammar as including things that, in fact, Goldberg never really talks about, which is information structure and pragmatics, and I will spend some time on those. When speakers produce an utterance, constructions are in this constructicon are assembled. And I'm going to use this as an idea for talking about change. For example, why didn't you go is conceptualized as an assembly of several constructions. Next, please. It consists of what are called substantive microconstructions. Those are the individual words. They're substantive because these are segmental and they're not abstract, not very abstract. They're abstract only in the sense that we know them as units that we can use in producing utterances. So there's why, do, not, you, go. Those are all microconstructions, small constructions. There's a larger event construction, which is motion away, go as opposed to come. Purposive adverbial construction, there's for a reason. Now that the reason, of course, is not anything to do with the going, but what is your reason for not going? It has a, in this case, it has scope over the upcoming clause. There's a negation construction, there's an interrogative construction, there's auxiliary inversion, which gives you why didn't you go, as opposed to why you didn't go, and a past tense construction. There are, of course, many others. There are prosody constructions. That's just an idea about the concept of any utterance being an assembly, because I'm going to be using that later in talking about change. So Goldberg characterized cognitive construction grammar this way in her 2006 book. All levels of grammatical analysis involve constructions, learned pairings of form with semantic or discourse function, including morphemes or words, idioms, partially lexically filled, and full phrasal patterns. Any linguistic pattern is recognized as a construction as long as some aspect of its form is not strictly predictable from its component parts or from other constructions recognized to exist. In addition, patterns are stored as constructions, even if they're fully predictable, as long as they occur with sufficient frequency. Now, nobody knows what sufficient frequency means, but the important thing there is that they are learned. Goldberg focuses on language use, tested examples, not universals. Patterns are stored. Patterns constitute a language user's knowledge of language. Semantic patterns may override form. Her example in the 2019 book is Explain Me This, which her child said, using a pattern based on something like, tell me, get this, give me this. It matches the ditransitive pattern. And here in 5, I'm giving you some notation. You're probably familiar with it, but just by way of reminder, the ditransitive comes out as verb, recipient, patient, or better, and this is the kind of formalism I will be using. On the left, you have the form. On the right, you have the meaning combined with a double-headed arrow. So the form is verb, object 1, object 2. The meaning is cause a recipient to have the patient. So give Mary a book is verb, object 1, object 2. Linked to the meaning, cause Mary to have a book. Next, please. Pattern match and creative extension are both ideas I will be using quite a bit. They are used to evoke interlocutors, especially addressees or readers. And since I'm a historical linguist, I have to talk about addressees and readers because the data that I'm using is written, who unconsciously, probably, sometimes consciously, use learned patterns to interpret or produce new constructs, thereby creatively extending patterns. When we get to talk about the difference between constructionalization and grammaticalization, this will be key, because until approximately 2007, nobody doing construction grammar paid much attention to pattern and analogy. I'll talk about that, but pattern is absolutely crucial to Goldberg's idea of construction grammar and to mine of constructionalization. The match may be approximately. We often don't understand the interlocutor. Not everybody is gracefully nice and cooperative. There are uncooperative, unimaginative people. There are also people who can't hear you very well. And some people, it has been studied, some people on the autism spectrum simply may not be able to make matches. So talking about pattern match is an idea that pertains to most language users, but not all. Next, please. So what does usage-based mean? A lot of people have talked about usage-based models, but they almost all come back to Kimmer and Barlow's introduction to a book on usage. And that's Suzanne Kimmer on the left and Mike Barlow on the right. Next, please. And what it means, a usage-based model, what it means is the speaker's linguistic system is fundamentally grounded in usage events, instances of a speaker producing and understanding language. Like right now, I am speaking and hopefully you are understanding. A speaker's grammar consists of general representations made up of specific instances of use. And frequency plays a role in acquisition of knowledge. Higher frequency results in increased entrenchment. I'm sure you're familiar with this from Joan Bybee's work, which has been extensive to support that notion. Her work is all usage-based. But frequency is important. I don't work with statistics, so I won't be talking much about it. Comprehension production are integral to the linguistic system, so are learning and experience. Units of language are dynamic, subject to creative extension and reshaping with use in a kind of feedback loop. That pertains to what I cited earlier for Conier's statement that everything is dynamic and meanings are potentials. So everything is subject to creative extension and reshaping with use. There's always the potential for regular aspects of context to become conventionalized as part of the linguistic system itself. And we will be talking about how that works. Now, let's think again about a construction. It is a sign. It is a form meaning unit. It's a pairing. And some people think that, therefore, in fact, you'll find in Somera and Smirnova's introduction to their book on nodes and networks, that a sign is a fixed holistic thing which has no internal structure. Well, that won't work if you want to talk about change and language being dynamic. So the hypothesis is that form meaning pairings are, yes, they are units, but they have internal structure, which is subject to change. And Croft hypothesizes that form has at least 3 components and meaning also has at least 3. And each of them can change, and so can the symbolic link connection. Next, please. You're probably familiar with this, but the important point is that the construction, that outside box, shows the unit. A word like go, for example, or form, or any of these words that are here. They're units. But inside those units, there's form. Those units have a syntactic property, a morphological property, and a phonological property. Construction grammar actually has not got its mind around phonology very well, I'm sorry to say. So normally we're talking about syntactic properties and morphological properties. On the meaning side, there are semantic properties. It means something. There are pragmatic properties. There are those range from social to informational structuring kinds of pragmatics, and there are discourse functional properties. And these are all linked by a symbolic link. I find this a very useful model for talking about change, and I will be doing so later. Next, please. So we have a construction, which is a unit with complex internal structure. And how do we acquire this? Well, the idea is that children, adults, second language learners, generalize over instances. These are called constructs. And they generalize over them to make abstract conclusions, which may then be even more general. So consider the quantifiers: a lot of, a heap of, X, a bunch of X, a bit of X, a shred of X. Each one of us can hear an individual construct like a lot of stones. If you hear it often enough, it can be stored as a conventional form meaning pairing. And that is stored then as a unit, a lot of X. X is a variable for any kind of noun that can occur in that slot after a lot of. Some can be stored even more abstractly. Maybe after a while, you come to the conclusion that there's a whole bunch of words and phrases in English that refer to large size. They include a lot of, a heap of, a load of, and a bunch of. None of which will behave exactly the same, but I won't go into that. Some can be stored more abstractly as large size quantifiers and some as small size quantifiers. So a bit of, a shred of, an iota of, a dot of, and so forth. And both these classes can be generalized over as a quantifier schema, which can be displayed as a taxonomic inheritance network. Next, please. So at the bottom, you have the constructs. A lot of, that's why I put them in phonemic transcription. A lot of, a heap, a bit, a shred, and more. As I said, a lot of, you hear it frequently, and so it can be generalized over, and the hypothesis is that stored in your knowledge base, in your mind, is the sequence a lot of. it's really a unit because it comes out as a lotta and people spell it ALOTTA and various other things with plenty of evidence that people really conceptualize that as a unit. And that belongs to a larger set, which has, as I said, a lot of, a heap of, a load of, and so forth, and is a submember or subschema of the larger schema quantifier. Of course, there are other quantifiers in the language than these. There's much, many, a few, some, and so forth. So this is just a small subset of the inheritance hierarchy of quantifiers. And it's called an inheritance hierarchy because everything at the bottom essentially has the same sorts of features as the things above. So all of them have a noun in them, a lot of X, a lot of noun. Some of them allow nouns that are quantified, like a lot of books. For the most part, a load of goes primarily with the singular mass nouns. So a load of hay, a load of nonsense. So syntactically, it behaves somewhat differently from a lot of. Next, please. In various places, Goldberg refers to construction grammar as a theory. What makes a theory that allows constructions as a construction-based theory is the idea that the network of constructions captures our knowledge of language in toto. In other words, it's constructions all the way down. Now that has been a nice soundbite. Sometimes these soundbites are a bit dangerous. So if I may have the next one, it has been questioned. Next, please. So in the squib asking, what would it take for us to abandon construction grammar? Hoffman rightly asks us to think what all the way down means. He points out that a theory should be testifiable and falsifiable. Are there really parts of language that are not constructions? And I will say that, yes, I think construction grammar is testifiable, testable, and it is falsifiable in parts. And that particular quotation is constructions all the way down. Our knowledge of language is constructions in toto, is, in fact, falsifiable because it's testable. Excuse the typo there. But I think probably not everything in our knowledge of language is, in fact, a construction. And my example is the position in which discourse markers can occur. I've frequently been asked, I'm not going to talk about this any more than just this moment. I've often been asked whether the slot in which a discourse marker can occur is meaningful. Well, yes, it is meaningful. Is it a position? Yes, it's a position and it is therefore a form. Is it a construction? And the answer is, in my view, no, because although we know that we can use that slot to introduce an upcoming topic, particularly in turn taking in the conversation, there is no particular meaning attached to it. And so I think that there's nothing really that can be stored there in terms of a form meaning pairing. Something for you to think about. You might disagree with me, but That's how we go about testing whether a statement is falsifiable or not. So, Hoffman suggests that a theory needs to be falsifiable by psycholinguistic neurophysiological data. I don't do psycholinguistics, but some people do, and there have been tests of some of the things that Goldberg has discussed. She is a psycholinguist now and working in the psychology department, and very interested in child language acquisition, and she does do experiments, and I'll talk about one of them that's been done for ditransitive. And Goldberg, 2003, did in fact pose some testable questions about construction grammar. Hoffman worries that people, including linguists, tend to look for evidence that supports their views. And of course, most of the work that we've done has shown very dramatically that it is constructions all the way down. But there's always a good opportunity to be aware that we tend to want to support our particular positions. I think we also need to be aware that striking sayings like constructions all the way down are really very valuable and drawing attention to hypotheses that invite critical thinking. So please, let's all of us think critically about what is suggested, because these are all hypotheses, as I said. Theories are hypotheses, in my view. Okay, next, please. So I'm coming to the end now of my discussion of cognitive linguistics and construction grammar. And the takeaway points are: linguistic knowledge is knowledge of form and meaning pairings, and it is usage-based. And now I will go on, next please. Now I will go on to introduce some basic ideas about historical linguistics that I'm going to use in the later lectures. Now, if you do historical work, the purpose of work on language change is interpretation of linguistic data. Texts, spoken archives, primarily, however, texts are what we have. To determine what changes, how it changes, those are mechanisms, and why it changes, those are called motivations. So if we take a Goldbergian perspective of cognitive construction grammar and usage-based perspective onto the question, what changes? The answer has to be usage changes, and with it, representation in memory of usage patterns. Now, this is orthogonal, entirely orthogonal to generative grammar views of historical linguistics, where the basic idea is that grammars change. That's because in generative linguistics, there has been the hypothesis that we all have some kind of innate universal grammar within us. So usage changes is the patterns that we use in language in everyday conversation change. And furthermore, they are not specific to language. They are part of human experience. I didn't talk about that earlier, but they're part of cognition in general. So usage change, when taken seriously, requires us to think of speakers and writers and addressees and readers doing things with language, as Noel said in his 2019 paper. There are references at the end of this PowerPoint, by the way. All the references should be there. Next, please. And since we're using a usage-based approach to data, I think it's very important to try to avoid reifying language, treating it as an object, and using such concepts as constructions prefer some context. It's not constructions that prefer context, it's speakers and writers who prefer a particular construction. People talk, and I have talked about competition. A lot and much don't compete before an adjective. Speakers and writers prefer to use one over another. I know that it's hard to avoid, and in fact, language change is very clearly a reification. It's not that language changes, speakers change language. Something to try to avoid, however. And Joseph and Janda, I think quite rightly said, as Joseph on the left and Janda on the right, given the transmissional discontinuity of language and in individual minds, it behooves us to resist the temptation to speak of particular linguistic constructions as if they were organisms with lifespans larger than those of humans by several degrees of magnitude, much less as entities independent of people. I think that's a very useful thing to keep in mind. I try to, but I will admit that it's not easy. And as I said, language changes does in fact violate that objective. Next, please. So, basic principles. Each individual needs to learn a language. And the likelihood that the knowledge of that language that is learned is exactly the same as that of others, especially older caregivers, is almost nil. Acquisition is a lifelong affair, especially in contact situations. Therefore, innovations occur all the time. But that does not mean that language changes. Innovations occur in the individual, but if I produce something new today, that doesn't mean the language has changed. Or if you produce something new today, it doesn't mean the language has changed. What does it mean for the language to change? Next, please. Innovations are not changes, in my view. Changes occur when some innovations are adopted by a group of language users. That is when innovations are conventionalized. That is a disputed position because it's difficult to define a group, especially in historical work. We don't know who's writing for whom or who's speaking to whom. Every individual has several roles, several social networks. However, with the advent of electronic corpora and microstatistical analysis, it has become possible to trace developments in individuals, and I'll give a couple of references. The problem that I have with that is that individuals are a very modern notion. The idea of an individual, particularly an individual author, was not available, or at least not common or discussed in medieval times and earlier. So when people say, well, yes, we can look at developments in individuals and think about individual change and innovation, yes, we can, but we can only do so in a very short time period, the last 500 years or so. Next, please. And morphosyntactic change is typically gradual. You're no doubt very familiar with this from grammaticalization. Change is never A to B, it's always A to A and B in alternation, and sometimes becomes B. There's always variation for a while. We think of it as polysemy. A may never cease to be used. If you think about be going to be, which started out and still is a motion construction, for a while it coexisted with the future, it still does. But I very much doubt that anybody other than a linguist these days thinks that those two are linked in any way. They no doubt notice that they're spelled the same way, but the link is no doubt lost because as speakers, we use be going to be gonna be, not be going to be, if we're speaking in conversation. So that's an example where be going to motion was just that, and then it alternated with future, and it was a polysemy in people's minds, we think. And then in this case, it did come to be B, leaving the A as a totally separate construction. Next, please. Steps in change are currently usually consistent to be tiny. There's sneaky shifts. I like this metaphor that de Smet came up with, as sneaky shifts. They're hardly noticeable in a corpus or across individuals. This is very different from what I grew up with as a graduate student. Lightfoot, 1979, privileged catastrophic change and saltations and big jumps in a model of generative grammar that thought of large parameters. UG consisted of very large parameters, and then in change, the language learner shifted from one parameter to the other, and it was necessarily huge and catastrophic in the saltation. But in generative grammar, parameters have become minute as well. And the shift that we have in both models of grammar to tiny steps in change is largely related, I think, to corpus work and quantitative studies. So whichever kind of historical linguistics you do these days, you're going to be working with very tiny changes. Next, please. Now, there are some domains Graham Trousdale and I have talked about where there does seem to be some instantaneous change. If you have a pattern of word formation, and this is really only in word formation that one can generalize, once a pattern has formed, a new word formation does appear to be instantaneous. You can, in English, take any noun and make it into a verb, like to calendar, to fax, but you can take some new item that has just appeared on the market and you can turn it into a verb. We have things like adjective being converted into a noun plus ness. So happiness, listlessness, you can do that. Some of them are very funny, but the same, I think, can be said of what were called snow clones by Jeffrey Pullum. It's a kind of cliche. X is the new Y. Here's some new ones I found recently. Retro psi is the new black. So retro psi is the new thing that's all the rage. And weird is the new normal. But the rise of the pattern of the snow cone and the pattern of noun-verb conversion, adjective plus s conversions are quite gradual, and you can certainly show that with the snow cones. Next, please. So another set of terms that have been discussed a lot are reanalysis and analogy. Reanalysis has been quite foundational in historical linguistics. And the question that it asks is, how is expression X different from expression Y with respect to such things as bracketing, category, etc.? Langacker, very famously in 1977, introduced some quite basic ideas about reanalysis. They are, as I've just mentioned, bracketing and category change. So a typical example would be going, that's one set, which is the motion. And you can say, be going somewhere in order to do something. I'm going to London to visit my aunt, for example, which comes to be going to verb. So you can no longer put anything in between going and to. Indeed, that used to be a phrase. It's now spelled as one word, which is what it is. Not every phrase that is now one word is spelled that way. I'm thinking of things like, in fact, all the same, be going to, and so forth. Reanalysis being closely connected with grammaticalization, though it doesn't help explain unidirectionality. But the term has been problematic and people have been worried about it. A child who doesn't know an analysis can't reanalyze it, and nor can a second language learner. So the term neo-analysis that was suggested by Henning Anderson in 2001, I think is preferable. I'll be using that. Next, please. Now, as I mentioned, reanalysis was considered foundational in work on grammaticalization. But until recently, analogy was considered very questionable, was thought to be inadequately theorized. And Lehmann in 2004 rather famously refers to pure grammaticalization without analogy. Pure grammaticalization has no analogy. But work on analogy asks, how can expression X be matched to expression Y? And on what grounds? Is it on grounds of form, meaning, both? Typical example, various plural markers in English were analogized to S. So we used to have bulk, bench, which is like foot, feet. Well, we still have foot, feet, but feet. But bulk, bench was analogized into book, books. Same is true of daughter, which used to be like sheep, sheep, and now is daughter, daughters. These were all analogized to a particular type of noun in Old English. So we get stones, donna, stone, stones, and they were analogized. Next, please. An analogy is very strongly associated with construction approaches to change, since it involves pattern match. Match is usually to the subschema, not a particular microconstruction. But I would like to say that each analogical change is, in fact, a case of neo-analysis. So if you take bulk plus its vowel alternating plural, changing to bulk plus a general plural, through the mechanism of analogy. Nevertheless, it is also a case of reanalysis because you don't have the same structure. What you have as part of your knowledge of language is the book is just like any old other noun. In English, it takes an S plural, but you do have to learn that foot is not like any other noun in English, or sheep is not like any other noun in English. You have to learn those things. Children sometimes overgeneralize and analogize, but changes have not happened in standard English, at least. Next, please. So, summary of the key points about change are that change involves conventionalization in the community of speakers and language users. Morphosyntactic change is gradual. Analogy is a crucially important change type, but all change involves neo-analysis. The converse does not apply, however. Not all change involves analogy. So with that, I would like to end for today. I'm sorry we started late. We had my problem not being able to get the PowerPoint up. Next time, we're going to discuss Graham Trousdale's and my hypotheses about constructionization and construction changes, and talk about some updated definitions. What I propose now is that we take a break for, say, 5 minutes, and I hope you have some questions. And Professor Oliveira has very kindly agreed to check what questions have come up in chat and to forward them to me or ask them to me in about 5 minutes. So thank you, and let's take a break.
Should we start the question and answer session now?
Yes, that's fine with me.
Okay, good. So do you want me,
Maybe get rid of the PowerPoint.
sure, yeah. Do you want me to read them or should I put the questions in the chat? What do you prefer?
Well, if they're in English.
Yeah, they are in English.
Okay, let's see. Is procedural sense, is grammatical, are there any distinctions? Okay. I take it that the question is, are procedural and grammatical the same? Do they mean the same thing? And the answer is yes and no. There's a huge overlap. Tense, aspect, modality, case, markers are definitely grammatical in everybody's definition, and they are procedural. But there are some things, and here I come back again to discourse markers, that have not always been considered grammatical, but they do exactly what Meibert, Mosier, Hansen says, which is they cue meanings. They are instructions, directives to hearers and readers and how to interpret upcoming information. Now, there are a lot of people who would not include those among grammatical items. I do. Bruce Fraser, who's been writing about them since 1990, well, actually since the late 80s, considers them grammatical, but not everybody does. And one of the reasons for not doing so is that they are not part of the argument structure of the clause. So procedural is has a wider range, and it avoids particular theories of what syntax looks like and what is grammatical. Grammaticalization and becoming more grammatical beg the question, what is grammar? Something that those of us who have worked on grammaticalization have often found a little hard to deal with. So procedural is useful in that regard. What adjustments considerations should be made in the research of a language in use when adopting a constructionist perspective, which has a formalist aspect? I think the major adjustment you need to make is to ask yourself the question whether the formalism is based in the concepts of being usage-based or not. As I mentioned, there are construction grammar variants. Known as sign-based construction grammar, where usage-basedness is not necessarily adopted as a position, as an assumption. Now, the question is what one means by a formalist aspect. If you mean by formalist aspect that you want to formalize, yes, you can formalize construction grammar, and I do try to do so. I won't show you too much of it because it's hard to put on a slide, quite frankly. But I have tried to formalize changes in discourse markers in the book I'm writing on the rise of discourse markers in English. If you mean by formalist something of the type like well, a sort of more generative position, then I think you can very much do it in terms of sign-based construction grammar. There's also Luke Steele, and very many other people who have done work on more formal versions of construction grammar. The thing is that for the most part, except Miriam Fried, nobody has done historical work in it, and so that's why I'm not discussing that. How to distinguish semantic, pragmatic, discursive, functional properties in Crofts model. All right. Again, if I may take my discourse markers, I worked extensively on, by the way, I'm looking at all the same and so forth. Let's take all the same. It's very interesting. It's historically, it derives from all the same. Everything is the same. Everything is equal. But in many languages and in English in many cases, something that is considered to be the same historically in change comes to mean not the same. How in the world does that happen? Well, I think it happens because if you say something is the same, A is the same as B, they're not the same. You wouldn't say, you would have no reason to say that. I think in the case of all the same, where all means exactly the same, the all, as in all sad, like very, is the, it's an extreme on a scale. There's ample evidence in the data that people thought that everything being the same was extremely boring. This was the end of the 18th century. And there's also the influence of French quand même, versus même is same. So it appears that quite frequently people have taken the semantics of sameness and pragmatically interpreted it as not the same, as a concessive. Now, what's the discourse function there? Well, the discourse function in this case is that all the same functions as a discourse marker, like however, like nevertheless, not part of the argument structure of the clause. It occurs outside the clause, at the beginning, in the middle, at the end, like most discourse markers in English. And so I hope that's fairly clear that there are distinctions there. I would say that the pragmatic markers don't really have any real semantics. Historically, they did. All the same is a very good example of what I talked about, that you have an earlier form A. These are all the same thing. And a new use appears at the peripheries of the clause. And it is concessive. It means although. It's a nice little formula. Thank you all the same, which you know means thank you, but no thank you. So there's a change there and its function has changed. Oh, that's a very interesting question. If constructs are usage data, then they shouldn't be in the construction network as they are not virtualities. Correct. Maybe it is. Now, I haven't thought about that. Goldberg always puts them there. They are, but I think you're right. I need to think about that. I'm going to jot that down because that's a very important question. The reason that she puts them in there is that they're building up. Her argument is that children, second language learners, hear constructs and build up generalizations. And yes, you're right. The generalization is the network. Good, thank you. That's a very valuable question. What would be the formal properties of the quantifier? Well, I think there would be an abstract quant, as I think there is in pretty much any formal version, which has a pairing with a meaning that has something to do with amount. And the amount can be either size or number of elements. So the formal properties would be, again, a form meaning pairing. One of them would be, the quantifier is always a modifier of a noun. So that would be part of its syntax. And therefore it's part of the DP. So the nominal phrase, and part of the demonstrative. And the meaning would have to do with the, as I said, the amount. That would be a start. I haven't actually formalized it myself, but I'm sure one would do it that kind of way. So the next question, the theoretical model foresees two types of constructionization, the lexical and the grammatical. Parallel, there's the conception that lexicon and grammar are on a continuum. So how to operationalize hybrid phenomena, neither prototypically lexical nor prototypically grammatical? What type of constructionization would account for the type of phenomenon, given that two types exhibit different properties? That's a good question, and I am in fact going to address it because in Cousset's volume, constructionization meets grammaticalization, or grammaticalization meets constructionization, I don't remember which order. One of the points that's made is that there may be a problem because the theoretical model distinguishes lexical and grammatical. It doesn't. They're on a continuum, as I mentioned. That doesn't mean there's no distinction. The prototype absolute extreme ends of the lexical and the grammatical ends, yes, are different. But since there's a continuum in between, I would first of all question the first statement. The theoretical model foresees two types of constructionization. No, it doesn't really. I think grammaticalization does that. Constructionalization doesn't. Parallel conception of lexicon grammar on a continuum, yes. So how to operationalize hybrid phenomena? Well, I think the operationalization is something that Freed back in 2008 did rather nicely, that if you take a model somewhat like the Croft model that I showed you, she uses the sign-based model, but it has many similarities. If you take such a model and you trace the changes within that model, you can show the reduction of the prototypicality by actually what she did was she used a grayscale representation. Now, I'm sure you can do other ones by showing degree of lexicality, degree of grammaticality. So that's a formalization. It's not an operationalization. I think an operationalization is always the question, how contentful is something? If you think back again to grammaticalization, what about thing? Thing is not very contentful. Therefore, it is likely to be grammaticalized. Table is very contentful, it's very specifiable in terms of numbers of semantic features, but thing isn't. So we've always had to deal with the fact that some lexical items are much more contentful than other ones are. And however we operationalize that, we would operationalize it either if we're doing grammaticalization or if we're doing minimalism or we're doing construction grammar. We have to make distinctions between things that are more contentful and less. And I hope that answers the question. It's always a question what people mean by operationalizable, but I hope I've tried to address two aspects of that. Isn't conceptual procedural a way of bringing back grammar lexicon? Well, yeah. It's not bringing them back. It's just somewhat reconceptualizing them. Because, as I said, procedural covers more than standard views of grammatical allow. This all pertains to what do we think grammar is? A very basic question that is not always addressed, right? It's a Hoffman type question. What exactly do you mean by grammar? Does your grammar allow things like discourse markers to be procedural? Mine does, some don't. I mean, most minimalist grammars don't. So it's not bringing it back, it's focusing, it's a terminology that's focusing on the fact that certain things, lexical things, are supposed to be sort of units stored in memory, whereas other ones really are designed to get hearers and readers to conceptualize and construe in a certain way. Now, Langacker, of course, talks about everything is construal, but there's a lot more construal going on when you have a procedural than there is when you have a standard lexical item, in my view. Where are we here? What are the main differences between comparative historical linguistics and usage-based historical linguistics? Well, depends on the kind of historical linguistics you do, but if you do comparative historical linguistics. You've added in the word comparative there, and part of your objectives are to try to establish what the structure of a language at some time of non-recorded history was like. So if you're studying African languages currently, which have no historical record, or Amerindian languages, which also have no historical record, you are inferring from current variation, and variation that is structural and variation that is dialectal, you are inferring what the past looked like. In fact, Johanna Bachdal has done a huge amount of reconstruction. She has a fabulous article, which I think may be on some bibliographical reference down the line, but I'm not sure. Reconstructing woe into European. Woe unto you. It's an exclamative. So she is reconstructing an exclamative, and it's a brilliant piece of work. It's not really usage-based because there isn't any usage to reconstruct. So I would say, in answer to your question, what's the main difference is that anything that is a historical work does make hypotheses, which are kind of reconstructions of what might have been, say, an Old English speaker's knowledge of the language. So we have to say might have been, we don't know. There's no way in which we can tell what an Old English speaker had in or her mind. Not sure that we can tell what current speakers have in mind, but we can tell better. When you're doing, we make hypotheses based on usage that is available. And I do work with Old English text. If you go beyond that and go back to proto-Germanic, anything that's called proto is going to be a total reconstruction and hypothesis. And there you are not reconstructing usage, and you're not basing it on usage of the time. You're basing it on usage of later times. So, don't know whether that answers the question satisfactorily, but anyway, I think I'm going to mention a little bit about that next time, but I'll see. I might add it. Okay. Reifying constructions. I'd rather talk about personifying. I'm not sure. Okay. Okay. Talk about personifying them. Yes, I think personifying may be a good expression. I think there's a lot of people have been talking about, in linguistics, have been talking about reifying linguistic phenomena. Is it a bad thing to personify? Well, I really find it problematic, although I've used the word compete. I think it is really hard to justify saying that much and a lot of compete, or will and be going to compete. In what sense? It's the linguist is looking at them and saying, okay, they're in variation, and one seems to be used more than the other. I think you talk about competing, you get off topic. So it may be that some personifications are all right, and we certainly do that in language change. But I would do a Hoffman and say, be cautious about what one is doing? Is it a useful personification that will get you somewhere, that gives you better understanding of language? Or is it one that actually denies that the linguist is doing the work, or the person is doing the work as they're learning a language? All right, which process is a larger approach, constructionization or grammaticalization? What way does one contain the other? I'm going to be spending a whole lecture number 3 on that, but I'll give you a short answer. The issue is, what question does each kind of work address? In grammaticalization, the question is, how does a gram or a grammatical item come into being? That assumes that you know what a grammatical item is. We've mentioned that several times, that might not be all that clear, but that's the question. And that means there's a very limited domain. There's a lot of language that's covered a lot, but it's very limited in the big picture. It's much smaller range of linguistic structures under discussion. If you are a constructionist, you think of large constructions. Goldberg's first and most famous one is the ditransitive. Give someone something. There's no way in which that could be a topic for somebody studying grammaticalization. The way construction, which is also part of the 1995 book, is discussed by Israel in a 1996 paper, I think. It's the first historical constructionist paper was published. Now, the way construction, he draws in grammaticalization, and I think that may not be wrong. I think that's probably good insight. That it started out with things like force your way through through a tunnel, something like that. Strictly motion, strictly some kind of resistance. And it got extended in various kinds of ways to things like wiggle your way across the branch. And it got extended to, most recently, various kinds of locution. She giggled her way through the meeting. Now, in those later, and they're all 19th, 20th century examples, there is a kind of iterativity that gets imposed on giggle. Well, giggle, yes, takes some time, and we all know it iterates. And if you push your way through something, you have to continue doing it. But there's a shift from continuative to iterative. And that is the subject matter of grammaticalization. So I would say, as Israel said, that part of that constructional change had something to do with a grammatical change. But the whole thing is not a case of grammaticalization. The whole thing is a concept of a subject doing something that is in some sort of opposition, or later, not so much opposition, because giggle your way isn't through the meeting is not really opposition, but is through time. So I think what is covered is different. In that sense, constructionalization includes what is covered by grammaticalization, but it does a lot more. I'll talk a lot more about that later.
That's all the questions that we have, Professor Traugott. Thank you very much for this brilliant first lecture. And there is a forum in the platform where people who didn't have the chance to watch the first lecture live, they can ask questions, and I will forward some of them to you. Okay, and you can answer them live if you want, or even in the forum yourself. So thank you very much. Do you want to say something else before we close the session?
Well, what I would like to say is that you have my email address. And if you would like to email me some of your questions, I'd be very glad to answer that way as well. But otherwise, I will certainly answer them on the forum. The more questions there are, the more comments there are, the better. And sometimes you think about something a few days later. I do. So please feel welcome to engage in discussion one way or the other. But thank you. And they were very good questions. And that one about constructs not being in the network is something I really need to think about. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.